Welcome to Connie Palmer Sewing. The technique that we're going to learn today is how to do Madeira Applique. A lot of people have asked about this technique, so I thought I'd show this today. Technique, the way I am showing it today, is for the bottom of a skirt, for like a skirt band, because that's where a lot of people use this, and we love the pretty scallops with on the skirt, on the bottom of the skirt. So that's why I chose that. There's lots of other ways you can do Madeira Applique, petals and flowers and things like that, which we'll do that another time. This is for a skirt. The only real notion that you need is some water-soluble thread, and that can be purchased at most sewing machine stores. I'll put a link below if you need to order it if you can't find it, but it's just called water-soluble thread. Now, the thing is, you're going to thread your machine with the water-soluble thread on the top and then regular thread in the bottom. You only need it on one, top or bottom. Some machines are very I don't know. I think the thread is very tender, and so once in a while you'll find a machine that the thread breaks when it's on the top. So to solve that problem, just wind a bobbin with this thread and put it in the bobbin and put regular thread on the top. Now, if you have a bobbin full of that thread, I really wouldn't wind a whole bobbin. I would just wind maybe a quarter of a bobbin. But just write on that bobbin that it has water-soluble thread in it, and maybe put it in a little plastic bag with the spool. And that way you're not going to accidentally use it for something else. That's very, very important. And after you get done sewing with this thread, make sure you take it off the top or take it out of the bobbin, whichever one that you've put it in. Again, very important, and because you obviously know what'll happen. So for a skirt band, it's really easy because you're just going to do 2 strips of fabric for the band, because you're going to do the front and the back at the same time. Now, you only have to trace your scallops on one layer. You don't have to do it on both layers, just on one layer, and make sure that you are tracing on the wrong side, because that's the side we're going to put right sides together on our fabric. So we're going to put right sides together like this. So I've got 2 pieces of fabric and they're right sides together. I want to make sure you know that. And you're going to sew with the water-soluble thread on the top or in the bobbin, like I said, and you're going to sew right on the line that you traced. Now, I've put pink thread right here. I don't have the water-soluble thread in this one, but I do in the rest, because it's, it's kind of clear, so it's hard to see. But what I want you to remember is, as you're sewing this up to the top, up to the peak, right here, and I've drawn a little picture of it, you want to not just go up to the point and pivot and come back down. You want to do 1 stitch, pivot and do 1 stitch straight across, and then pivot and then go down the other side. So you're going to pivot and make 1 straight stitch right at the top of the mountain. That's very important, because as we're going to trim this in a minute and trim across the top of the mountain. And that 1 little stitch, as small as it is going to leave more space for you to turn it right side out, for you to get a nice point. If you don't have that stitch, it's very hard to get a nice point. So now we've sewn it. You see it's front and back. And then you're going to take your scissors and you're going to trim leaving about 1/8 of an inch of fabric above your sewing line. Now here's where, remember I had my little straight stitch across. I'm going to trim straight across also, and then come down the other side. Now I do want you to think about this. As we're trimming, we want to have just about 1/8 of an inch of fabric left. And you want to do that as straight as you can. I mean, as even as you can, because this is what you need to remember. what you leave is what you're going to see that's turned back, because usually your fabric is very fine. You know, if it is like a light blue or even a white, so on and so forth, you'll see that little seam on the right side. So you want to make sure that you try to make that as, you know, nice as you can. Now this one's all trimmed, and now the first thing we're going to do is turn it right side out before we go to the iron. And this is how I turn mine right side out. I just stick my thumb. Now I do have some fingernails, but the fingernails really don't make this easy or whatever. Just stick your thumb up in here. Then I take one side, I'm doing the left side mountain. I'm pressing it away from me, if you can see what I'm talking about. I'm just pressing it away from me. This one I'm leaving alone. Then when I turn it right side out, I get more of a point. And I can actually almost just wiggle it like this and get a point. If you can't get a point, then get a point turner and just push it up like so. But I'll tell you that pushing one seam allowance one way and the other is going the other way helps it a lot. So I'm going to do it again. I'm just going to stick my finger up in there. And I just did it the wrong way. Press it either towards you or away from you. It really doesn't matter. You're just doing it one way or the other. And the other piece is going to go the other way. And then put it up into a point. See, it just goes right up into a point. Plus you've had that straight stitch across the top. So you've left a little bit of room for it to go up there. And so see how nice and pointy those are. Now we're going to go to the iron. So I'm going to just take a little break here. I'm going to go to the iron and I'm going to press these and show you how you're going to pull them apart. Okay, here we are at the iron. And I've already turned it right side out. You watched me do that. Now, a couple of things that I want you to remember before you're pressing. Number one, you're going to need some type of spray starch. Because remember, we want to get rid of the water-soluble thread. So we're going to dilute it with a liquid, and then we'll be able to separate this into two pieces. I usually put I use an iron, yes, but I put a towel over wherever it is I'm going to spray starch, whether it be my wool mat or my ironing board, because you can ruin your ironing board with a lot of starch with the type of thing that we're going to do. So I usually put a towel down, and that way it saturates the starch. So the first thing you're going to do is give this a press. Now, you don't want to have too much steam in your iron at this point, which mine does, but we're going to go quickly. So, trying to stay out of the way of the camera there. Because we want to have a nice crease. We want to start off with it good before we spray starch it. Now, you also want to have a press cloth, because once it's starched, you don't want to put your iron down on all that wet starch, because it'll just make a mess out of your iron too. It's liable to even stick to it. So now we're just going to spray starch the seam. We don't have to spray starch the whole thing. We're just trying to dilute that water-soluble thread. Now I'm going to move it down away from where I spray starch, because this is wet. So you don't want to really try to dry that. You want to dry this. So those are just little tips that I have learned along the way. And now we're going to press until it's dry. And you're not ironing like this, you're just pressing, because as that thread turns loose, and if you're going back and forth, you'll actually move your seam allowance or your fabric, and it won't be pretty, because we want all the edges pressed under nicely so that we didn't have to hand roll them underneath. Now I always flip it over too. Now this time you probably don't have to use the press cloth because it's not so saturated. But you certainly don't want to pull these apart while it's wet, because then your seams won't be nice and turned back. So now all you have to do is just pop these apart. Now if they don't pop apart easily, this one is coming pretty easy, then you'll stop and you'll spray starch just a little bit more. Or sometimes if you just even take the scissors and clip one little seam, and that's all it would take. So now look how pretty that is turned under. It's just perfect, isn't it? So now you have two pieces, one for the front skirt and one for the back skirt. So that's how we get started. That's how we make our two strips. So now I'm going to stop and go to part 2, if you need it, on how to sew this onto your skirt. So to do our skirt, and this is going to, now it's a small skirt, sort of looks like for a doll. It might not even fit a doll, it's kind of short, but I wanted to be able to fit it into the camera. So what you'll do is you're going to mark your seam allowance and sew one seam allowance on your skirt. And then you're going to lay it out wrong side up. And you're going to sew your band together, because I did a 3/8 inch seam allowance down both of them. I drew it on there because you know me, I'm a drawer, and I actually sewed that seam allowance right down, you know, on the 3/8 inch seam. Okay, then I pressed it open, and I actually clipped these because they were sticking up past there. You can see how they just would stick up. So I clipped those off and I pressed the seam open. Now all of my scallops are actually the same size. And that's why I wanted to make sure that the top of my scallop was right in my seam allowance. I hope that makes sense. Now we have to make our skirt the same size as our band, because we're going to sew 2 circles, and we need both circles to be exactly the same so that they'll work out, right? Okay, so I'm going to mark the middle. I mean, not mark the middle, I'm marking the 2 seam allowances. And then I moved my band all the way over, and you can see there's more skirt than there is band. So I marked my seam allowance for my skirt the same size as the seam allowance for my band. So and I did that on both sides. You can see that. So now when I sew up my skirt and I sew up my band, I know that they're going to be exactly the same size. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to go to the machine, sew those up, and come back and show you how I'm going to pin it on. So now I've made 2 circles, the one with the skirt and the one with the band. And I thought I'd show you this side, since I just sewed it, how it's sticking out, and that I'm just going to trim it right up to so that it doesn't show, because once it's all sewn on, that'll be all underneath anyway, so it won't be loose or anything else. So see, it looks real pretty. Now, remember, these are our sides where the seams are. Now, we're going to pin the right side of the band to the wrong side of the skirt. So I'm going to match up my skirt as soon as I can get it opened up. I'm going to match up my seam allowance on this side. And if you have a big skirt, then I would mark the centers of my skirt, center front, center back, so you have more places that you can, check and make sure that everything is right. So I'm going to do this side. And then the rest should just pop right together, because remember, we made 2 that were the same size. That's very important. So you can see how now they fit real nice. You can pin the rest of the way around. and then I'll go to the machine, and I'll be back in a second because I'm going to sew all the way around. I'm going to trim the seam again, just like we did on the scallop, and I'm going to understitch, and I'll show you the understitching when I come back. I'll do it in a different color so you can see. Understitching is very, very important on seams that have to be flipped back because it makes them flip back easier and crisper, if you know what I mean. So now I'll be back in a few minutes and we'll have this all sewn together. Look how pretty it looks. I just love it. I love Madeira Applique. And you can see how I've understitched. Remember, I told you I would do it in another color. Where that pink thread is, that's where I understitch. So what you're doing is you're sewing the seam allowance to the skirt, or you're doing the seam allowance to the facing, whatever it is that you're working with. Because I use understitching in a lot of things, like when you're sewing a collar facing on, collar and then the collar facing, it keeps the fabric from rolling to the right side, you know, where you don't want it to be. Plus it makes it nice and crisp, the fold. So I decided I would do a step out for the understitching so it made a little more sense to you, because some people do not know about understitching at all. So remember, I placed the right side of the fabric to the wrong side of the skirt, and I sewed 1/4 of an inch seam across the bottom, and then I trimmed that to 1/8 of an inch. So this is 1/4, and you're just taking half of it off. Now you can't, just remember, what you leave is what you see when you're finished. I promise you it'll show through. But you can't trim any more than that off, or your seam's not going to hold. But the main thing that I'm trying to impress on you is just take half the seam allowance, but make sure you're trimming it nice and straight, because you will see it if you're jiggy-jaggy. So jiggy-jaggy, if that's a word. So then what you'll do is you'll press this seam towards your skirt. Just go to the iron and press that seam towards your skirt. But make sure that you don't have, see how that little fold is right there? Make sure you don't have that little fold in there. So press it on both sides to make sure you have that back. And then all you do, once you have the seam pressed, is you're going to stitch on the skirt part, because that's not going to show. Of course, you're going to do it in white thread. You're not going to do it in pink thread. And then when you're done sewing it, you'll see, look how easily that just flips back. You almost don't even have to press it. It's so nice and crisp. So if that makes sense. So understitching is something that's very, very important. So I make sure that I always do it on my skirt parts. Now, the only other notion that we're going to add now is we're going to add our sew line glue pen. And I use the sew line glue pen for a lot of things that I want to attach to something else, and I don't want to use pins. And I don't want to use pins in this because as I sew along, I want it to make sure that it's staying where I wanted it to be. And sometimes if you just pin it, then it moves along. I'm sure you know what I mean. It kind of creeps along. But I only use a sew line glue pen. I don't use a pen from the Elmer's glue pen. I don't use any of those. Whatever you use, it's up to you. I know that the sew line glue pen is going to dry very quickly. It's not going to harm my machine. So that's where I'm going with that. And I'll put a link to where you can get it if you can't get it locally. So what I do is I just lift this up, and I'm going to put a little bit of glue right along that little seam line, and then just push it down. Just mat it down. Now that is going to keep it from creeping as you're sewing, if that makes any sense. I know it does to you because I know you've had it happen. I've had it happen. You've had it happen. We've all had it happen. There. And this washes right away. The first washing, it washes away. So you don't have to be worried about it. But see how nicely it attaches down. And this dries very quickly, so you don't have to wait very long before you sew. See how our seams are matching up just perfectly because we've planned it out. Now to sew down the Madeira Applique, that's a whole nother story all by itself, isn't it? Most of us like to use a pin stitch, and I'm not going to do pin stitch in this video. I'll do another video on how to pin stitch scallops because maybe you don't have pin stitch on your machine, but I don't want this video to be so long that you don't watch the whole thing. It's very important that you watch the whole thing. So this is just preparing our skirt for sewing it down, right? Y'all with me? So now you can see how nice and flat that is. And it's ready to, it's ready to sew. Now you can see what I'm talking about, where that seam allowance is down underneath there, and you definitely can see it. So if one was big and one was small, that wouldn't look so very good, would it? And see, you can see it down here too. And this fabric is a quilting fabric, so if you had something like Swiss Batiste or whatever, you'll know that it's going to show a lot. So just pay attention to those things. I'm trying to give you the tips to get your best product in the end is what I'm trying to do. Now, normally I would certainly pin stitch this all the way around. If you don't have a pin stitch on your machine, you could certainly just do a small zigzag. You could do a straight stitch all the way around, real close to the edge. I mean, who's going to know? I mean, that's just, you're trying to make a pretty decorative skirt, so it really doesn't matter. The person you're giving to probably doesn't even sew. She's not even going to know. You could do a decorative stitch here, or you could do it off the edge. There's so many different things that you could do to decorate to have the sewing on the bottom of your skirt. But I promise I'll do another video on just pin stitch, because that way you can really pay attention. So saying that, I just want you to remember that if you really like the video, to make sure you click like, and subscribe is the most important thing. I need all the subscribers I can get. And leave a note if there's something that you didn't like or that you have a question. And just remember, you want to create.